supervisors serve as a person to not only help enhance the individual's professional functioning and help them to become better and more skilled while they're early in their career. It also allows us to monitor the quality of services. So we, as a supervisor, we're responsible for any of the services provided by those people we're supervising. And it does allow us to serve as a gatekeeper for the profession, which unfortunately is sometimes an issue. You start to identify issues in supervision that are of concern, and that maybe help a person identify that maybe I need to take a step back and go work on myself a bit before working with other individuals. We love tech. Oh. I'm sorry to make facetious jokes. I tried to help out as a coordinator for a different ECHO program yesterday because Jamie was not with us as she was enjoying time with one of her children, and all of the technology was a complete cluster, which only proves to me how invaluable Jamie is. I'm very uncomfortable with that. We should spend a couple more minutes talking about Jamie. So what really got me thinking about this, and I mean, it may seem a little unrelated, but one of the things that we do with the medical students is a course called Humanizing Medicine, and there's a section of that called Reflective Practice. So we have the students read things that get them thinking about the humanities and what it's like to be a human and also a physician while they're developing these skills and working themselves through the early parts of the profession. And we're on a section right now with our third-year students on derogatory humor or gallows humor and cynicism. And it's interesting because you start to see some of the ways that supervisees alter some of their view. So in the third year, they're going through clerkship rotations. It's a very high stress time, but it's also the first time that they've really gotten to work with patients. It's also the first time that they're exposed to a lot of professionals actually in the field, and a lot of what they end up hearing is some pretty ugly humor that's directed towards patients. Some of this is part of humor, just because I know when I worked in a community mental health center, we would say all the time, you have to laugh, if not, you'll cry. That's part of it. It definitely is, and it can be very helpful. But at some point, the language that we use and the way that we phrase things definitely influences our thinking and starts influencing our biases, and particularly the implicit bias. So there's this interesting relationship between gallows humor or derogatory humor, cynicism, and burnout, and that it's a very complicated scenario. So I picked a couple little comics. Actually, the one on the bottom right is from a book called 101 Uses for a Used Catheter, Healing with Gallows Humor. And you can buy that book on Amazon. But humor is, and it's an interesting thing. I'm guilty of using humor to diffuse situations. It's definitely one of my coping skills. And it can help diffuse stressful scenarios. It can even potentially help avoid burnout. It contributes to camaraderie amongst professions. But when does it start to impact our ability to connect to the patients? When does the language that we're using in the humor actually start to influence the way we see patients? And one of the things that jumped out at me, I mean, the students are really good at identifying these things pretty early on and saying, well, the jokes about obese patients or people who are considered the self-abusers, those people who are, it's a food issue or seems to be a food issue because of the obesity, or people who are using drugs, alcohol, or other substances, and the comorbid conditions that end up as the result of those, suddenly those patients they see in the hospitals are subject to some of the worst humor. And that then is also translating into the types of stereotypes that we have about those patients. So one of the students that I heard recently actually had said, well, the alcoholic, obese, drug addict isn't going to get as better. They're not going to go home and get well and stay well. And therefore they're depriving us of what we want out of this whole process and in the sense of achievement that I did something good. And I think that that's really scary to start hearing students and any health professionals, because it's not just students, it's all of us, engaging in the kinds of things that what on one hand started as humor really starts to turn into stereotypes and judgment and the risk that we're going to treat patients poorly or just not give them as good of care. Certainly also influences how we interact with patients and some of our nonverbals, our tone of voice, all of those things that go into good clinical care. So how does stuff like this play out in supervision? I got to talking to my husband about ad hominem attacks. So that's where something's going on in your interaction and somebody, instead of responding to the actual content of the dialogue, is more motivated by feelings or prejudices. So a couple interesting examples that you can come up with we'll get to some of the examples. Actually, I have a couple horror story examples, but so stuff like this, we see it play out in politics all the time right now. But this could play out weirdly if the attitude we bring to supervision is towards the supervisee. If the attitudes that we're coming to supervision with is towards the patient, but with the supervisee. So this is kind of the stuff that my medical students were talking about, where they hear jokes made by attendings or hear jokes made by residents, and they're supposed to kind of laugh along to gain the favor of the person that they're shadowing, that's precepting them. Or attitudes towards the patient by the supervisee that maybe we don't agree with, but now we're in a position of having to fix. So there's multiple layers of how derogatory humor, gallows humor, cynicism all play out in supervision, depending on who is the potential attack of whatever the humor is. So when supervision goes bad, there is a very interesting article that I found that actually gives, I think it's 11 different narratives. And so on one hand, this could be things like, you aren't very good at this, you should maybe go be a roofer instead. Certainly not a very nice thing to say. But these are just two clips from a couple of fairly lengthy narratives that were given that really are kind of scary. So one, the person is saying Supervisor X edited reports and did so without tracking changes. And then when getting into supervision, the supervisee is asking for, why did you change this or that? And the response was, you asking me questions is challenging authority, and you just need to accept these changes without question. Further down a bit, same individual shared that they had a multi-ethnic background, and the supervisor interrupted the group who was talking and said, yeah, we get it, you're a mutt. Now, obviously, these are very ugly things, and things that we should never engage in, but where is that line of, so what's going on with this supervisor that now they're attacking this person? So the second quote there is, I have met with a therapist. Sorry, I have to read this off of my screen because multiple things get in the way. Oh, thank you. So I've never met a therapist with your personality. You'd be better suited as an accountant or something similar. So the example that I've given, you should go be a roofer instead. But instead of telling a person what they've done wrong or what skills they need to improve, this could certainly come out in making the supervisee feel like as if there's something flawed within them. Obviously things that we don't want to do. Oh, sorry. So one of the ways that we can get to this is through cultural humility. And cultural humility, I'm sure you'll hear about cultural competence a lot, particularly with that last example of we know it, yeah, we get it, you're a mutt. That is not demonstrating cultural humility or cultural competence. I like the terms cultural humility because frankly, competence insinuates that we can actually achieve it. And I know that competence is very important in all health professions training. I need to have competence as a counselor in providing cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. I need to demonstrate competence in my ability to assess for suicidality, just like a physician needs to demonstrate competence in listening for particular heart sounds or lung sounds and making a diagnosis. We all have very distinct competencies, but can you really ever be competent in culture? Certainly, any culture other than your own. So cultural humility is really more of a stance of taking a step back and constantly looking for self-awareness and wanting to enhance your knowledge, your skills, and accepting that I can't fully know another culture. So how the supervisor engages with a supervisee coming from a place of cultural humility is really important because that contributes to the process and the outcomes of supervision. A supervisory stance of humility also contributes to a strong working alliance and serves as an antidote to potential microaggressions or not so microaggressions like in the previous slide. And it can be really difficult also for supervisees to work with some of their own stuff. Maybe they are having some culture issues with the patient. So this is where we can actually help them to identify some of their own blind spots or some of their biases. And by engaging in the process and admitting our own cultural humility, we're then modeling that behavior to the supervisee so that they can better utilize it with their own patients. Then I ran across something that's a little bit different. It's actually very similar in a lot of ways, but narrative humility gets even beyond cultural humility because let's say you grow up from these, on the surface, you would think that me and Simon have a similar culture. We're white, we're American, but that would really be simplifying lives. And it would be gross simplification. So just because somebody comes from what might appear to be a very similar culture, that doesn't mean anything about their narrative. So their narrative is really that patient's story. And how do we ever really help a person and act on our, all of us are in this profession to somehow reduce suffering. Whether it's counseling, social work, being a physician, a nurse practitioner, a pharmacist, all of this we're all coming at this from a place of reducing suffering of patients. That's our goal. So how can we really do that if we're narrow-mindedly looking at their culture and thinking that we could understand it, or simply looking at their culture and not really hearing their story? So narrative humility allows us to get to that fundamental human need of relational connection so that we can be seen and be heard and understand what really matters. And it's more of a philosophy of listening and the skills that allow us to witness the patient's story that is inherently always going to be other. We can't truly know their story, but we want to try to get there the best that we can. So can you teach this? I mean, this is something that makes our innermost humanity present, but this is not something that you can put into some check boxes. I mean, we can't give you a checklist of skills that say, well, now you're demonstrating narrative humility. If you see that somebody's upset and touch their knee for 3 seconds and then say, that's really hard. It looks like that's really hard for you. We can teach students to model empathetic statements, but that's not true empathy. So one of the ways that we actually can do this is through using stories, narratives, having them write their own stories and narratives, and hearing those of others. So I actually have a book in my office because from a different project, but it's all narratives for medicine. And it's really to get to some of the social determinants of health, but the intention of the book is to help people understand what some of the social determinants are by reading them through patient stories. More specifically, reading them through patient stories as remembered and reinterpreted by their clinician, which is important for the clinician to do in order to start to think about, well, what am I missing? So humility is a tremendously powerful thing. It makes you realize that you'll never understand, but really implores you to keep trying anyway. It is that central interaction that actually might even allow you to give a voice to patients that otherwise wouldn't have one. And it can be taught through reading stories or writing your own, witnessing stories through an oral history. Narrative humility allows clinicians to recognize that each story we hear holds elements that we're unfamiliar with. Different dynamics, but allows us to be open to ambiguity, to contradiction, and to engage in constant self-evaluation and self-critique to see if we're really hearing what exactly is being said. It helps to address hierarchical imbalance in clinical relationships, and this applies not only when working with patients, but it applies and when working with your supervisee. Inherently, there is a power differential there. There's power dynamic. We hold the key to them being able to become independently licensed or continue to work in practice. And if you do choose to look into those narratives about when supervision goes bad, I mean, there are some very serious things that go on that make people question whether or not they should stay in clinical practice, or people even being held up from being able to move themselves through their practice at an according pace because of having a supervisor that was not demonstrating any type of narrative humility. But also acknowledges that the clinician and the supervisor both have to put themselves in a place where they're willing to engage with some transparency. And this is the thing that maybe is a bit more uncomfortable and is a little contrary to some of the things that we're taught when we're going to school for this. I mean, so in order to hear and fully see the person in front of me, I have to also be willing to be seen and heard. So I might have to share some of myself, which is kind of a scary thing for individuals, whether as a counselor, I'll say it's contrary to what I was told. Like, this is not about me, it's all about you. But sometimes you have to make it about you in order for the person to be able to feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about themselves. And the same goes for clinical supervision, even more so because I can't expect the person in front of me to be able to do all of the things they need for their patients if I'm not willing to demonstrate and model it myself. So the clinician must not only see but be seen, and hear and be heard. It allows the physician or the clinician to place themselves in a position of receptivity. So you're not just acting upon others, it's acting with others. It's, to some degree, once you start, instead of just being a witness to stories, then you start co-authoring some of the narrative, particularly illness narrative, when you're working with patients over time. And as a supervisor, you do the same thing. So being able to demonstrate, not only teach individuals how to do this, but then demonstrate that you're willing to do that alongside with them. So there's a bunch of resources and places that I found the various images. The narratives of harmful clinical supervision is where some of those really bad horror stories are. And the top article, The Art of Medicine, Narrative Humility, actually has a corresponding TED Talk, which is great, and I'd be happy to share the link to. There's some pretty good research going on in the world of narrative humility and how it takes things a couple steps further than just cultural humility.